"Hey buddy, get the hell off my lawn!" This is what I heard before the punch of cold water against my face. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on the grass. I quickly sat up and saw an angry middle-aged man glaring at me. His hose was dripping from the nozzle after the spray while still being aimed at me. I looked around and realized that I was in a suburban neighborhood. "What are you, deaf?" the man demanded. "I said beat it!" He sprayed me again until a voice interrupted him. "Henry?" A woman around the man's age called out to him from the house behind us. "Henry, what's going on?" The man whom I'd gathered was Henry told her to go back inside. "This homeless bum is sleeping on our lawn, Maggie," he said. Maggie approached us while observing me. "Since when do homeless bums wear such nice suits?" she inquired. I looked down at my clothes and realized that I was wearing some formal attire. Henry noticed my clothing and agreed that it was strange. The only peculiar thing about my clothes was the handkerchief missing from my jacket's pocket. Maggie bent down to my level and asked for my name. I opened my mouth to answer her, but when I did so, nothing came to mind. I can't remember," I said. "I can't remember anything." Henry and Maggie looked at each other in confusion and concern. Maggie then helped me up and ushered me to their car. As we drove off, Maggie said that she and Henry were taking me to the hospital. I didn't object, as I'd been feeling lightheaded since I woke up. Part of me also hoped that the doctors would help me regain my memories. On the way to the hospital, Maggie formally introduced herself and Henry to me. They'd been married for 16 years. Henry stepped out of the house that morning to get the mail when he found me lying unconscious on his front lawn. He explained that a homeless man passed out drunk in front of their house 3 weeks prior. When Henry found me, he thought I was another bum and wanted to get me away from his house as soon as possible. The doctor who examined me asked me a series of questions, but unfortunately, I couldn't recall anything. The last thing I remembered before Henry was fire and lots of screaming. There were no burns on my body. The only injury I had was a stitched-up stab wound on my back. The doctor deduced that the wound was about a month old. I was taken to a hospital room for further examination. 5 minutes later, the police entered my room. It turned out that the hospital called them in hopes that my stab wound would help to identify me. Thankfully, the police knew who I was. My name is Drake Bluewood, and the stab wound was inflicted on me by my neighbor, William. According to the police, William lived in the apartment across from mine. I was in front of my apartment's door about to unlock it when William stabbed me from behind. Another neighbor from our floor heard my scream and tackled him while his roommate called 911. William claimed that I killed his brother Randy and wanted revenge. However, there was no evidence linking me to Randy's murder. William was charged with attempted murder and sent to jail. Even though the man tried to kill me, I felt sorry for him. The guy had to have been very close with his brother if he wanted to stab his killer. I asked the police if I could talk to William. I know how crazy my request may have sounded, but something told me that William could help me remember everything. For all we knew, I could remember something that would identify Randy's killer. The officers reluctantly agreed to my request. I was taken to the jail where William was held and came face to face with the man who hated me. He glared at me as I sat at the table before him. "You've got some nerve, Bluewood," William growled. "Unless you're here to confess, I suggest you get out of my sight." I explained my situation to William and asked him if he knew anything that was connected to his brother's death. I don't think he believed that I had amnesia. Regardless, he was willing to tell me everything he knew. Apparently, Randy was involved with a club in our city called the Claret Fellowship. It's a club dedicated to celebrating individualism and diversity. Randy and I were both members of the Claret Fellowship. In fact, it was I who convinced Randy to join that fellowship. For some reason, Randy wouldn't talk about the club even to his brother. He was found dead in his own house only 2 years after joining that very club. William blamed me for his brother's death because he often saw Randy and me together. The police didn't find any signs of a break-in. This indicated that Randy invited his killer inside because he knew him. Of course, none of this proved that I killed Randy. Although, I did find this information useful. I asked the police to take me to the Claret Fellowship's clubhouse. The police agreed and came with me. They suspected that whatever caused my amnesia may be the result of something bad. The Claret Fellowship's clubhouse is just like any other country club. I entered the club with a couple of officers. The receptionist gave me a friendly greeting and asked for a membership ID. One of the officers showed her his badge and asked to speak with a manager. The receptionist picked up the phone on her desk and told someone named Mr. Claret to come to the front desk. A well-dressed man in his 70s came to us. A small golden name tag that read Claudius Claret Jr. was attached to the jacket of his burgundy-colored suit. "Mr. Bluewood!" Mr. Claret hugged me as if we were old friends. "I'm glad to see that you're doing all right. Where on earth have you been?" I explained that I had amnesia and was wondering if Mr. Claret knew what had happened to me. Mr. Claret shrugged, saying he had no idea how I got amnesia. He then recounted what happened the last time he saw me. The Claret Fellowship was hosting a charity event the previous night. Mr. Claret and I were chatting when he suddenly excused himself to use the restroom. When he returned, I was nowhere to be found. Nobody noticed me leaving, and the clubhouse's CCTV system was acting up all day that day. Mr. Claret wanted to call the police when I failed to answer his calls, but he was sure that they wouldn't look into it and say that I just went home after drinking too much. But when Mr. Claret came to check on me the next morning, he learned from a neighbor that I never returned home. "How did you know Drake's home address?" one of the officers inquired. Mr. Claret told the police that he learned my address through the application I submitted for membership. He then offered the officers and me a tour of the club as an attempt to jog my memory. As we walked around the country club, I noticed a clearing with 3 evergreen trees. The evergreens were standing in a straight row. Mr. Claret noticed me gawking and asked what I was looking at. Feeling a little embarrassed, I told him that I was admiring the 3 trees in the clearing. "Oh, those?" Mr. Claret questioned. "Those have been there since before the country club was built." The Claret Fellowship was founded by Mr. Claret's father, Claudius Claret Sr. He was in the process of designing the club when he stumbled upon the evergreens. Claudius was amazed to see 3 evergreen trees standing in the middle of a clearing. Therefore, he found it would be better to leave them be. I approached the evergreens when a strange sensation washed over me. I saw the evergreens burning and a group of people standing before them. A hand was placed on my shoulder and the scene reverted to normal. An officer asked me if I was doing okay, as I seemed to be in a trance just then. I said I was fine, and we continued with the tour. I couldn't stop thinking about what I just saw. That vision was eerily similar to my earliest memory. Did I imagine all of that, or was that also a memory? I asked Mr. Claret if there was a fire last night. He was taken aback by my sudden query. Mr. Claret denied that there was ever a fire at the Claret Fellowship. The police backed him up, as 911 never received such a call. When I was looking around the country club, I couldn't see any burn damage. At the end of the tour, Mr. Claret asked me if I'd like to attend tomorrow's event. Not wanting to arouse suspicion, I accepted his invitation. When the police drove me to my apartment, I told them what I saw at the Evergreens. The officer suggested that I just hallucinated on account of my recovery. As plausible as it sounded at the time, part of me felt that it may have not been my imagination. The landlord gave me a new key and I entered my apartment. That night, I took off my jacket and tossed it onto the floor, desperately wanting to sleep on the bed. When the jacket landed on the floor, something fell out of the pocket. I picked it up and saw that it was a small medallion. Engraved on the medallion was a cursive C and a star. When I saw the sigil, something awoke inside of me and I remembered everything. The Claret Fellowship wasn't the community it made itself to be. Some of the members weren't even human. They were actually monsters disguised as people. The thing is, not many people are accepting of monsters. I, on the other hand, always felt otherwise. I won't go into detail as to how I learned about the Fellowship. I don't want to risk the safety of my friends. I can, however, tell you what the Fellowship is really like. Yes, we do hold charity events. Any of the organizations we've donated to could tell you that. I would also like to tell you that the Claret Fellowship wasn't founded by Mr. Claret's father. In fact, that's the only part of the story that's false. The Claret Fellowship was founded by Mr. Claret himself. He's an immortal who founded the Fellowship many years ago. Mr. Claret was friendly with all the members, so much so that some of us have spent time with him outside the club. We even invite him to our homes sometimes. That's how Mr. Claret knew my address. Everything was great until the day I lost my memory. I was returning home from work when I heard William shouting from inside his apartment. I don't know why, but I decided to listen in. Most of the things he yelled were profanities, but I couldn't make out what he was shouting about. Somehow, he was convinced that the Claret Fellowship was to blame for his brother's murder. He was giving someone instructions on how to find me and where to take me. I couldn't hear any other voices, so William must have been talking on the phone. From what I've gathered, William was going to have me kidnapped and hold me prisoner until I told him everything I knew about the Claret Fellowship. Scared, I barricaded myself in my apartment and called Mr. Claret. After hearing my story, Mr. Claret asked me to meet him at the clubhouse. We met at the bar and Mr. Claret showed me his grimoire. It had a spell that will give me amnesia at midnight. By then, I'd be heading home and the kidnappers would take me. That way, I have no chance of revealing sensitive information. That medallion in my jacket pocket was the key to get my memory back. Each member had a small medallion to symbolize their membership. The plan was to have the kidnappers take me with the medallion hidden in my pocket. Once they realized that they wouldn't get anything out of me, the kidnappers would let me go. Mr. Claret would then meet me the next evening and help me regain my memory. The medallion was enchanted to break the amnesia spell once I touched it. As for the missing handkerchief, it was used for the spell, because it required an item that belonged to me. When Mr. Claret asked me what I wanted to use, the handkerchief was the first thing that came to mind. That night at the charity event, I gave Mr. Claret my handkerchief for the spell. When it was over, I took off my medallion and stored it in my jacket pocket. I was just getting to my car when a burlap sack was suddenly placed over my head. William and his accomplices took me to an old barn that had been abandoned for years. By the time they threw me in there, the spell had gone into effect and I forgot everything. My kidnappers eventually released me, but not in the way Mr. Claret had hoped. The kidnappers knocked me out before disposing of my unconscious body, right onto Henry and Maggie's lawn. I guess they chose that neighborhood because it was on the opposite side of town. I know that by now, you're wondering why Mr. Claret and I did all of this instead of calling the authorities. Yes, that would have been a quicker, if not better, solution. However, that would only risk exposing the Claret Fellowship's secret to the world. For example, The police could find the application forms and noticed that they asked the applicant's species. No way can the Fellowship trust the cops with confidentiality. By now, the Claret Fellowship has been relocated with a new name. Even us members have changed our identities. I don't know what happened to Randy. I'm not even sure what triggered those visions of flames and screams. In any case, I sincerely hope that the police find the ones responsible for his demise. Maybe there will come a day where the Claret Fellowship can reveal itself. But until then, you must remain behind the facade of your average country club.